And obviously, I think Mary Magdalene as a figure in the Bible is so mythologized, right? Like there's the idea that there's not very much in the canonical Gospels, and yet we have all of these ideas and notions, and like she was Jesus's wife, she was this prostitute, she had these, like all of these things. It's like there's so much story around her. And one thing that I think is so fascinating is the way that so many women in the Bible are kind of just wrapped up as like, oh, well, that was Mary Magdalene. And we actually don't have proof of that. But I've heard like the woman in the he who is without sin throw this first stone story. I've heard someone say, oh yeah, that's about Mary Magdalene. I've heard someone say that the prostitute that weeps at Jesus' feet and cleans his hair or his feet with her hair, that's Mary Magdalene. And that's why we get this narrative that Mary Magdalene is a prostitute. And it's like, why? There's an interesting thing that happens where all of these kind of women that exist in the Bible are just lumped into one figure, one woman, which I think is interesting and diminishing of the idea that like, oh, well, all women are the same. All of these women in all of these stories must be sexually impure. And if we're talking about the redemption of a prostitute, well, then they're just all basically the same woman. It's like, hang on. That's a weird thing that you're doing. Like, let's think about this. And even if you want to say, like, it's the same archetype or it's the same metaphor, like, sure, maybe. And I think the danger with this is that even if people aren't intentionally, like, trying to lump all women together or aren't intentionally trying to say any woman that's depicted as impure in the Bible is automatically sexually impure as well, the idea that it even happens slowly and surely over time is indicative of this undermining nature that happens and this dehumanization that does happen of women. And now, in modern day, even though Mary is the apostle to the apostles, the biggest question about her is if she's Jesus' wife. And it's like,
right?
Does that actually matter? One, there's no proof or evidence of it at all. And it's very much like we see this happen in media all the time where someone gets married and it's like, oh, well, I'm going to talk about them as this person's wife, not as themselves. And when men get married, that very rarely happens unless it's like the woman is extremely famous and they marry a non-celebrity. It's like, oh, well, then you're the celebrity's husband. But if two celebrities get together, the woman is immediately tied to the man, and they'll get questions all the time about their husband. And even, like, I think the example that's coming to mind is Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds. And while I'm not the biggest fan of either of them, it's interesting that Blake Lively is constantly asked about Ryan Reynolds and what's your husband up to and all of these things. And it's, well, you're Ryan Reynolds' wife. And we don't really hear the same narrative around, well, you're Blake Lively's husband. Sure, it happens sometimes.
Right, exactly.
But it's like, to look at the canonical figure of Mary Magdalene that discovered the tomb empty and say, but was she married? It's just like,
right.
What are we doing?
Right. Who was? Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting, this whole, the early church felt very differently about Mary Magdalene, it seems, at least based on these Gnostic Gospels, than, kind of we did later. And it's in 591 A.D., This really seems to be because of Pope Gregory the Great in 591 AD. And he's the one who in a famous sermon conflated Mary Magdalene
all of these
with
women.
These other, Mary of Bethany, who's the sister of Martha and Lazarus, so that Mary, remember, in John, as well as the unnamed sinful woman in Luke 7, who bathed Jesus' feet with her tears. And he basically said, these are all one person, from whom 7 devils, again, we get back to this devils thing, from whom 7 devils were ejected. And so and he went even further, which is where we sort of get this prostitute myth, right? Which is to say, she'd use the perfume to perfume her flesh in forbidden acts before repenting. And so that for 1,400 years, basically, Mary Magdalene's been branded as a repentant prostitute. So again, the classic archetype again of the redeemed harlot, right? So the hooker with a heart of gold, the pretty woman, right?
Yep.
And I think it's just important to notice that and to call that out. How and it's only recently I think that's been changed, and in fact I think Pope Francis made her the day celebrating her a saint equal to the male apostles as well. So things are changing over more recent times, but it's just interesting how one sermon changed how Mary was thought about for thousands of years, which is kind of wild if you think about it. At least in the Catholic Church, it's also important to point out that the Eastern Orthodox Church, for example, never did this. So this was done by Pope Gregory and kind of came into the zeitgeist, of course, because of Western Europe and Catholicism and so forth. But other Christian traditions don't view Mary in the same way that this lens that got put on her, which I think is something to just point out. So yeah, I think that's a super important. I think it's so important for us to separate truth from, sort of common knowledge, I guess, if you will. So what does and that's my issue. Like, examine the text. There's nowhere in the Bible that even remotely suggests any of the scandalous that somehow Mary Magdalene was anything other than a devoted follower of Jesus who, he helped her in some way through some healing and changed her life, whether demonic possession or otherwise. But she felt and she paid it forward and was a loyal follower even unto his death and beyond. That's all the Bible really says about Mary. Yet we've come up with all of these other things. So, I mean, when you lay it out like that, it's like, wow. I don't know. It makes me think.
Right. Well, and I
even
think,
just in laying it out like that.
Yeah, what you said about how it was Pope Gregory that did this, and even though it's in Catholic tradition, it has become kind of the narrative that is in the zeitgeist. And it's like, we want to talk about, like, in Christian circles, it's very much like, go back to the text. What does the Bible say? What did Jesus preach? And we need to go to the canon. And especially as we're about to get into this Gnostic Gospel that isn't considered canon in Western Christianity, there are still these narratives that are like, well, that's not canon either, and it's bought. It's totally accepted as truth, as a part of the stories that are told, the apologetics that are woven around the narrative of Jesus, that she was a sex worker. And I think of course, it just bears noting, like, even if Mary was a sex worker, doesn't diminish her devotion to Christ, doesn't diminish being the apostle to the apostles, but certainly in the eyes of Christianity, that lowers her status. It makes her sinful and impure. And by those standards, it makes it easier to dismiss a woman. It's like, well, she was a sex worker, so yeah, Jesus saved her, but, like, she's still a woman. And it is interesting how even the disciples, like, we have the tax collector, right? That's, like, not painted in a very nice light. And yet it's more kind of hand waved away, the things that other disciples do. And women are always tied with sexual impurity. And part of me with sex work too, and how it's represented in the Bible, is that it's just always placed on the women, and we need to cast out these 7 demons from the women. It's like, well, who's going to her? Who's paying her for her services?
Right, yes.
And of course that may seem like an obvious
they're being
point,
tempted.
but
those men are being tempted.
Right.
Those men are being tempted.
It
and,
repaints
obviously the devil is using Mary as the vehicle of temptation, right?
Right.
That's the story.
Yes,
That's the
and
story, and they're sticking to it, right?
Right. I think it really repaints the canonical narrative in a modern light. It's really looking at it through the lens that modern puritanical evangelical Christians want to proliferate, the message that they want to send, whether or not they actually believe it's grounded in the text or not, if it's just what they were told growing up. It's like, until I started doing my own research into biblical scholarship, I didn't know Mary actually wasn't a sex worker. I thought she was growing up because that was just what was told.
Yeah.
And I think probably most Christians have that view, or at least think that that is somewhere in the Gospels, even though there is absolutely no textual proof or evidence there. And so when we're talking about, accuracy, canonization of stories, and trustworthiness of narratives that you're basing your entire life on, I think it just bears noting, like, no matter what holy text you may be analyzing or choosing to integrate into your worldview, into your faith system, it always comes down to your analysis of it, and you need to be careful of what other people tell you about it, and you need to be doing the research and work yourself. And even the Pope Gregory, the leader of this text, was wrong. So it's like, do your own research. And I think part of my own research that I've really loved is reading the Gnostic Gospel of Mary. I think it is one of the most beautiful Gnostic Gospels, and the narrative we get around her relationship with Jesus in this gospel is just so profound to me, and really, it's potent, I think, is the word I want to use. The narratives that we really get here. So I guess I'll toss it back to you with any immediate reactions and then initial thoughts about the Gnostic Gospel.
Yeah, I think I think it's so interesting because first of all, the Mary is mentioned in several Gnostic texts, and she's the only gospel named for a woman. So the Gospel of Mary, which is a 2nd century text, and so it's just interesting how she's portrayed here, and which is a good example of how the early church, felt, at least portions of the early church, felt and viewed her role, who she was, and what she brought, compared to something, essentially 500 or 600 years down the road, and so in this gospel, and I just to tee it up for you, Reese, because it is so profound for you, and I'd rather you would be the one to share your passion for it, but essentially the Gospel of Mary portrays her as having received unique teachings from Jesus and being an encourager to the male disciples who are all scared. And there's some striking things that occur in this, where 2 of the male disciples, Andrew and Peter, get angry at her trying to teach them. Basically saying, Peter asking questions like, did he actually speak with a woman and not to us? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So now we're supposed to listen to her. He chose her over us. And it's just interesting. And he's rebuked as well. And so it does certainly suggest that Mary was a teacher and had a very prominent role. And so it's just interesting to me, and I'll tee it up for you to talk more about it, that we're so ready. So we were, as an entire culture, as a humanity, we're at least in the Western world, we're so ready to believe something that one man said versus, Gospels and things that were written hundreds of years before that actually show a different tale. Yet what sticks? Well, the fact that she was a sex worker. That's just interesting to me. But what was your revelation, I guess? Tell us more about sort of your connection to the Gospel of Mary and what it meant for you.
Yeah, I think firstly, learning that it was the first gospel that I learned wasn't included in the gospels. And I remember the first time I learned that the Bible wasn't fully the Bible. It's like there are people picking and choosing what to include in a holy text. Hang on. And so it was firstly this one of the first moments of questioning for me, not just of the church, but of the history of Christianity and how we practice religion and how messages are passed down, and who can we trust? Who do we trust? And why do we put so much trust into governing organizations, right, that have a vested interest in maintaining power and financial control, and that do really bad things to other groups of people? And it's like, it's kind of suspicious that the moral code is being dictated by the people already in power. And so I first dived into it just with a voracious curiosity for, what are they hiding from us? What are these people keeping from us? Because there's a reason that it wasn't originally included. And then also, I believe it wasn't published until the 1950s, I want to say. And it was discovered in Germany. And I think, of course, because of World War II and all of the horrible atrocities that happened in Germany, leading up to when the gospel was discovered, there's some murky history with how it actually came about, how we rediscovered it, and how it became published. But it opens up with this conversation, and immediately Mary, the other apostles are like, well, you got this secret teaching from Jesus that we didn't get? And Mary's like, well, yeah. She's just very blasé about it. And they're like, well, tell us. And then we don't have 3 pages. And there is just something, but before we started recording, we were talking about making meaning out of things. And I'm like, there is something so divine to me about the idea of a gospel where this one woman receives secret teachings from arguably the most important man in history, and we don't have what he said. The text is gone. The words are gone. And we will never find them. Of course, it kicks back in. We get the ending of what Mary shares with the apostles. That is this narrative about, it's very Gnostic in, the soul is trying to reach the level of heaven, and you need to ascend through these 7 layers of heaven, which is interesting with the parallel with casting out of the 7 demons. So I think there's something noteworthy there. Of course, the number 7 is everywhere in the Bible, but noteworthy. And she ends with kind of describing the way that, the soul reaches the kingdom of heaven by casting out the earthly body and the earthly kind of sinful nature of the physical body, which is very Gnostic and fascinating to me in terms of the way we philosophically conceptualize of mind-body dualism and how does the spirit interact with the physical body. And I just remember being so enamored with the fact that it's we're never going to have these secret teachings. And it's almost like this idea of Yahweh is supposed to be this unspeakable name of God, and yet we've still come up with a way to pronounce it, right? When we say Yahweh, everyone who has any kind of interest in this scholarship and research knows exactly what we're talking about, and yet it's supposed to be unspeakable. But when you put things into discursive language, like we were talking about earlier too, the way we use words shifts and changes over time, and how you use words impacts the meaning of those words too. And the same thing with names, and the name of God having changed and evolved. there's no way this secret teaching could really have changed and evolved, because we actually don't know it. And it's very much, it is unspeakable. And if these few passages being missing from the gospel aren't divine intervention, I don't know what is, because I would absolutely hate to see what some people would twist what is written in this portion of the gospel into. But actually what we get is this divine mystery, which I'm like, mystery is the most powerful thing to me. And I love that it's a group of men being like, please tell us what he told you. And she's like, okay, I'll tell you. But I have the secrets, you know? And even though she, there is this lack of belief there, just the energy that the figure of Mary Magdalene carries in the gospel, and in the Gospel of Philip too, there's some really interesting descriptions of her. And I believe that's actually where a lot of this myth around Mary Magdalene and Jesus being married is, because there's this idea of like the kissing that they would do. But of course, kissing even on the mouth was a Christian practice, because it's like you're passing the breath, you're passing revelation, you're passing spirit to one another through the act of a kiss. But just opening on this powerful figure, and it's like a woman is holding court about spiritual truth. And it's just, it's so good. And I love that it stayed mysterious, but also more and more people are talking about it, and talking about the way that this woman, you know, even though she's been labeled a prostitute, sexually impure, had these 7 demons, like we have this other narrative of her being kind of the chosen one. That's just really beautiful to me.